Bienvenue tout le monde à notre série de sommets exécutifs. Nous avons la chance et l'honneur d'accueillir le ministre fédéral Jonathan Wilkinson. So this is our first Fireside chat, and we are thrilled to be hosting the Minister Jonathan Wilkinson, responsible for environment and climate change. Just a quick housekeeping item. There was supposed to be a Q&A at the end of the session, but for time constraints, those will be hosted by Perrin. So once the minister speaks, Perrin will ask questions and engage with the minister around content issues, and then we'll move on to the following items. So to introduce the minister, I'd like to welcome colleague sponsor, Brendan McCracken, President of Ovintiv Canada. Brendan, over to you.
Thank you so much, Mario. I'm pleased to be here today on behalf of both the Chamber and Ovintiv. I'm also pleased to welcome our first keynote speaker, the Honorable Jonathan Wilkinson, Minister of the Environment and Climate Change, who will be delivering a keynote address followed by a fireside chat moderated by the Canadian Chamber of Commerce CEO and President, the Honorable Perrin Beattie. Minister Wilkinson has served as the Member of Parliament for North Vancouver since 2015. Raised in Saskatchewan, he spent more than 20 years in the private sector, holding leadership positions with companies dedicated to the development of green technologies. Minister Wilkinson's work as CEO and a senior executive at Questar Air Technologies, Biotech Environmental Technologies, and Nextera provided him with extensive experience in the energy and environmental technology sectors. He also previously worked at Bain & Company, a leading global management consultancy. A Rhodes Scholar, Mr. Wilkinson made use of his educational background in public policy when he worked as a constitutional negotiator and federal provincial relations specialist for former Saskatchewan Premier Roy Romanow. He has served on several industry and charitable boards, including the United Way of the Lower Mainland and the BC Technology Industry Association. He has also served as a board member and treasurer of the Walter and Duncan Gordon Foundation. Minister Wilkinson, welcome, and we look forward to your comments.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Bonjour à tous. I've certainly been looking forward to this opportunity. Just would like to acknowledge that I am coming to you from North Vancouver, which is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. And with apologies, I'm joining you a bit later than I think I had been originally scheduled in the program. It's not often that I have the chance to say that I was delayed by the Supreme Court of Canada, but I was delayed by the Supreme Court of Canada, which, as you may have heard this morning, upheld the constitutionality of a nice national price on carbon pollution. This is a historic day for everyone who believes we must build an economy that can effectively confront climate change. And this is fortuitous timing, speaking to an audience that values business certainty and is focused on innovation, because a price on pollution achieves both of those things. Just to quote briefly from this morning's Supreme Court ruling, quote, "The evidence clearly shows that establishing minimum national standards of GHG price stringency to reduce GHG emissions is of concern to Canada as a whole. This is a matter critical to our response to an existential threat to human life in Canada and around the world." I'll have a little bit more to say about this perhaps a bit later in my remarks. Cette année a été difficile pour nous tous. En tant que gouvernement, nous demeurons très concentrés sur la protection de la santé des Canadiens et sur la relance économique. However, governments must maintain line of sight on the horizon for threats and opportunities that are beyond the scope of COVID-19, and certainly none looms larger on both of those counts than climate change. Globally, the pace of change and innovation is accelerating, revolutionizing economic sectors and redefining the nature of competitiveness. A seismic shift is underway in global financial markets towards a rapidly evolving transition to a world in which low carbon products, technologies, and services will be in ever increasing demand. I certainly believe we've reached a tipping point in terms of global capital, and there is no going back. A number of major domestic developments, I think, underline how swiftly the financial and business communities are now moving. A significant number of major Canadian companies have committed to achieving net zero by 2050 and are actively shifting gears towards the development and production of low carbon goods. Several major car manufacturers in Canada with operations in Canada have announced moves towards domestic production of zero-emission vehicles. EV bus manufacturers are ramping up production, and some, such as Lion Electric in Quebec, are investing in the domestic production of batteries. Steel and cement makers are actively engaging with the federal government regarding how to take major steps to reduce emissions and to position themselves as globally competitive producers of low or no carbon products. And we are seeing companies including Enerchem and Suncor in Quebec, and just last week, Covenant Energy in Saskatchewan, making significant investments in alternative fuels production. La concurrence internationale est de plus en plus féroce, dont la conquête des parts du marché émerge à faible émission de carbone à l'avenir. Un avenir qui pourrait représenter des débouchés de 26 000 milliards de dollars et la création de 65 millions d'emplois dans le monde au cours de cette décennie. Government and industry must be thoughtfully and intently focused on defining and working to enhance Canada's comparative advantages in a low-carbon world. We must all think critically about which areas Canada has a natural or an earned existing comparative advantage, and what are the areas in which additional global advantage can feasibly be developed. Canadians are clear. They do not want our country to be left behind economically. No political party can have its head in the sand in the face of the hard realities we now face. Climate change is a reality. I can hardly believe that still needs to be said. And at this inflection point in world history, a country cannot have a sound economic plan without a sound and detailed climate plan. I don't want to get overly partisan here, but the circumstances compel me to say just one thing. You cannot say that you want to get to a goal without saying what tools or tool you will use to get there. We have been very clear about how we're going to get to the goals we've set with Canadians, including a price on pollution. Canada now has what is arguably one of the most detailed and most comprehensive climate plans in the world. We are going to challenge political parties across the spectrum to provide the same level of detail and certainty as we have as to how they will meet the environmental objectives they say they want to achieve. Canadians are expecting their governments to help propel us forward with thoughtful policies that facilitate economic transition and reduce emissions, policies that promote agility and innovation. Canadian businesses are, I believe, looking for government to play an active facilitation role, building on our strengths by supporting and accelerating innovation currently underway while incenting further innovation in areas in which it is required. There are, I guess, a few roles I would say that, in my view, government can usefully play. Investing in and incenting research and development in new processes and technologies required for the achievement of our economic and environmental goals. Secondly, assisting with the demonstration and the initial deployment of new technologies and new applications. And thirdly, pricing, regulatory, and investment mechanisms that will enable and accelerate the early deployment of necessary infrastructure and technologies. This is the focus of the Strengthened Climate Plan that the Prime Minister and I released in December. The plan is measurable and achievable. It provides clarity and certainty about how Canada will build upon the Pan-Canadian framework and enable us to exceed our current Paris emissions target and transition towards a low-carbon economy. It will create thousands of 21st century jobs along the way in every region of this country, and it will position us firmly on a path to achieving net zero emissions by 2050. Comme j'ai dit, ce plan est l'un des plans climatiques le plus détaillé, le plus concret et le plus exhaustif au monde. The plan's development was an all-of-government effort, and we listened closely to the views of many stakeholders, including the Chamber. The plan recognizes that business is at the forefront, playing a lead role through decisions to invest in new clean technologies and energy efficiency measures. Governments, as I noted, also have a role to play, a role that is perhaps best illustrated by the three buckets of strategic action in the plan. Smart regulation to incent focus activities in key emission reduction areas, investments to drive the development, commercialization, and deployment of technologies, and third, a price on carbon pollution. Let me just touch on each of those very briefly. Carbon pricing is a market-based mechanism. It is indisputably the most cost-effective way to reduce emissions. The future deployment of technologies like carbon capture, for example, are very much dependent on the notion that there is a price on pollution. In the Canadian context, a climate plan that does not price carbon pollution is simply not a serious climate plan. Il est temps pour nous tous, quelle que soit notre affiliation politique, de nous atteler à la tâche de faire avancer les solutions au changement climatique que les Canadiens et la planète exigent. The Strengthened Climate Plan also includes regulatory measures which set a long-term frame to reduce emissions, provide certainty to industry, and drive opportunities for the development and deployment of lower carbon processes and technologies. Examples would include targets with respect to methane emission reductions, the phase out of thermal coal, and the clean fuel standard. And third bucket is investments, and they're focused on developing critical low carbon infrastructure like transmission lines and zero emission vehicle infrastructure, investments to incent technology deployment and demonstration. So the top-up, the $750 million top-up for Sustainable Development Technologies Canada for demonstration, large-scale demonstrations of technologies, and funding for the Business Development Bank of Canada in terms of venture capital in this country. And then thirdly, on investments focused on accelerating the introduction of low carbon technologies and processes. So the Accelerator Fund that we set up to work with large emitters to essentially help them to adopt low carbon technologies as we move forward. The Low Carbon Fuels Fund, which is really about catalyzing the development of a domestic production of hydrogen, biofuels, renewable natural gas, and other low carbon fuels. The plan includes a total of about $15 billion in new investments. Taken together, our actions on climate to date constitute much more than an environmental plan. They are steps in an economic strategy focused on building a 21st century Canada that is resilient, dynamic, and prosperous. As a report from Canada's Economic Strategy Table put it, quote, "We have an opportunity to be the disruptor, not the disrupted." But of course, we need to do more. Governments at all levels need to do more, as does the private sector. Les engagements actuels pris par le pays dans le cadre de l'accord de Paris, s'ils étaient respectés, se traduiraient par une augmentation de la température moyenne de la planète bien supérieure à 3 degrees Celsius. To achieve the 1.5 to 2 degree level that science tells us we must, if we are to avoid the most severe impacts of climate change, we must significantly raise the sights of our level of ambition. In this regard, the Prime Minister has committed to bringing forward a new emissions target for 2030 to the US Climate Summit next month that is being hosted by President Biden, alongside the Americans, who will also be bringing a new target and a new nationally determined contribution. Achieving those targets, avoiding the incalculable economic, social, and environmental costs of a failure to do so, seizing the massive opportunities of climate action, all of that comes with a precondition that every order of government, every sector of the economy, every region, every community, every Canadian can play a role in this pivotal moment in our shared history. At another critical juncture in Canada's history in the 1940s, inspired by C.D. Howe, the public and private sectors worked together, shoulder to shoulder, to achieve the unimaginable, transforming Canada's economy in the process. A comparable level of urgency, resolve, and collaboration between business and government and all key players in Canadian civil society is what a secure and prosperous future for our children and our grandchildren now demands. The next 30 years will be a challenge. The stakes certainly could not be higher, but Canada was built by transforming challenge into opportunity. And I know that some people in business sometimes think that people in government and politics come a little bit from Mars and don't understand the business community very well. I want to close by recognizing that most of you here today are entrepreneurs, as I was before I made this decision to enter political life 5 years ago. The intersection of post-pandemic recovery and clean economy transition presents, I believe, the biggest entrepreneurial opportunity of our lifetimes. Seizing that opportunity will require every ounce of entrepreneurial ingenuity that all of you have. I understand that from government, you need policy clues that are clear, that are consistent, that are well thought through, and that provide certainty. We have certainly strived to provide such clarity, and we will continue to do so. At the same time, my colleagues and I are very, very interested in your thoughts, your ideas as to the appropriate path forward. We are committed to working with you to ensure that together we can seize this opportunity to create an innovation powerhouse that will secure Canada's place as an economic and environmental leader for the 21st century. So thank you very much for the time with you today.
Minister, thank you very much for your presentation. Thank you so much for being with us today. This is an incredibly busy day for you, I know, and the fact you would find time to be with us is much appreciated. But let's start with the Supreme Court decision, which you alluded to a little bit earlier. You correctly said that one of the byproducts of the decision is that it will give greater certainty to business, that we know where we stand and what the rules are going to be and how we're going to be regulated. And that's certainly something that's positive. However, there are still major concerns within the business community about the impacts of carbon pricing. And I wonder whether we can address that for a minute, particularly among small businesses and in agriculture as well. Can you address the concerns that people genuinely feel about the impacts on their competitiveness?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and I'm glad you asked it. I mean, certainly, if you think about potential impacts, the impacts on the consumer have been largely mitigated through the rebates. So the majority of Canadian families actually get more money back than they paid. The impacts on large emitters, by and large, through the output-based pricing systems, have also been largely mitigated in terms of the exposure for trade-exposed industries. But the issue where we still have some work to do, I think it's fair to say, is with respect to small and medium-sized enterprises. And we are looking very actively at that in terms of how we best go about that. Certainly, we are interested in finding ways to partner with small and medium-sized enterprises to essentially allow them to enhance the energy efficiency of their processes and systems to be able to essentially allow them to shield themselves from the increase in the price. That's the whole point of a price on pollution. Similarly, with agriculture, one of the things that we said is we are looking at a rebate for farmers with respect to things like grain drying and on-farm use of gaseous as well as liquid fuels. Not in a way that will obviate the price signal. So there will still be a price signal, which is the point of the price on pollution, but in order to actually ensure that it's not an economic hardship. And so we are very open. That's part of the conversation that we are intending to have with Canadians as we go forward, because the whole point of the price is to help people make the right choice with respect to emissions, but it's not to try to make it unaffordable. It's to try to actually ensure that we're doing it in a way that will be affordable and effective.
Minister, in your remarks, you acknowledged the fact that this is an area in which there are deep partisan differences as well. And the Supreme Court case was the result of provincial governments challenging the jurisdiction of the federal government. This means that today, on a split decision by the Supreme Court, we have a decision which will be divisive regionally, sectorally, in partisan terms in Canada. How do we begin to heal? How do we move from confrontation to collaboration, where there's a broad consensus in Canada that we need to hit net zero? We need to do it together. We can't do it by fighting with each other, but how do we get there from here?
Well, I think that's also a very good question. I will tell you one of the things that was not noted in the introduction in terms of my background was I actually spent several years as a federal provincial relations specialist working for the province of Saskatchewan. So I've seen it from the other side, and certainly one of the provinces that has had the greatest degree of challenge with the price on pollution has been the province of Saskatchewan. What I would say is, first of all, I think we have to try to step back and not focus just on one particular issue. And so in the Strength and Climate Plan that we announced in December, we actually started to talk a little bit more about regional approaches and regional strategies, trying to actually ensure that we were thinking about the different regions of this country and the economic opportunities that exist that are very different in Quebec versus in Alberta, for example. And so, you know, things like the Clean Fuels Fund, which is about biofuels and hydrogen and renewable natural gas, is primarily focused on the prairies, not exclusively, but primarily. You know, the Net Zero Accelerator is in significant way focused a lot on Ontario, which is about steel manufacturing and cement manufacturing. And so we are trying to actually find a basis for good engagement with different provinces on different issues. And I would tell you that at times, I think the media overstates the differences. Yes, we don't agree on the particular issue around pricing, especially consumer pricing, with some provinces. But I will tell you, I have very good constructive conversations with my counterpart in Alberta, for example, on a whole range of other issues in terms of carbon capture and hydrogen and biofuels and a range of other things. So I think the first point would be, let's not focus entirely on the things where there is disagreement. Let's focus on the broader picture where I think we all agree we need to make progress. With respect to the price on pollution, it has been the subject of significant debate, in part because I think there was a difference of opinion about whose jurisdiction it fell into. I think that has been resolved today by the Supreme Court. We've been very clear that a price has to be part of a plan to achieve our targets. In a country like Canada, I will just tell you, having been very deep in the modeling on this, it's just not feasible to achieve the targets that have been set out, even the existing targets, without a price on pollution. So I'm going to be engaging with all of my counterparts, as I have been, to try to ensure that we're focusing on the things we can agree, and ideally we can park this particular issue now that the jurisdictional issue has been resolved and move on.
We're going to need collaboration, obviously, internally within Canada, but we're dealing with climate change, and it means international collaboration as well. In the Healthy Environment, Healthy Economy plan that you released last December, working with our allies and trade partners to further climate action and accelerate innovation was one of the priorities that was included in that. Can you perhaps set out some of the opportunities that could exist through international partnerships and the challenges in working with jurisdictions that are further behind in their policy development? The Biden administration, for instance, recently announced a social cost of carbon of $51, whereas Canada's estimate was much higher. Are there ways to turn our first mover position into a greater advantage for Canadian industry?
Well, I think there are. I would start just by pushing back a little bit on the Biden thing. So the $51 was just intended as an initial placeholder to kickstart U.S. policy development. But if you listen to Biden's national climate advisors, he said the social cost of carbon is probably more in the range of $125 US. So they are in the process of trying to figure out where they go with some of those issues. But yes, international partnerships are important. In the context of, for example, the work with the United States that we are doing right now on both vehicles and on methane, I think that there are opportunities for us not only to accelerate climate action, but to actually build economic advantage. So the Americans are very interested in access to critical minerals, as are we. We are very interested in the production of batteries and ultimately the production of vehicles in Canada. They are actually quite interested in finding ways to ensure that we're thinking about this on a North American basis. So there's a basis there for some interesting discussion. Similarly on methane, I mean, Canada, as a first mover, we implemented or in the process of implementing the methane reductions that we agreed upon with Obama that President Trump had not enforced. That has actually kickstarted a lot of work around technology in Canada that actually will help us, I think, in the context of working with the United States and perhaps providing economic opportunities from an export perspective. In Germany, they are coming to us to talk about hydrogen because we, have done a lot of work on hydrogen over the past 30 years, and B, have natural assets with respect to the production of both green and blue hydrogen. Britain is coming to us to talk about carbon capture because Canada has actually been one of the leaders on carbon capture technology. But I would also say more broadly, one of the things that we included in the climate plan was this concept of a net zero accelerator. That was about partnering with large emitters to help them to make the choices with respect to technologies at end-of-life asset turnover, to enable them to make big step change reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and reposition themselves as the producers of very low carbon products. And I would tell you, like steel manufacturing, yes, there are technologies that can be implemented that are a little bit more expensive because they're still on the upper part of that experience curve in terms of coming down. And if you can actually make that decision to implement those things early, you don't lock in these huge emissions for the next 40 years. You actually lock in the ability to go out into the world and say, I have steel that actually is manufactured at zero carbon, and that will be a competitive advantage. The British Columbia Business Council has started a lot of this work around thinking about just the marketing advantage, let alone getting into this whole conversation about border carbon adjustments and stuff associated with low carbon products. There is a real opportunity as a first mover for us to actually take advantage of it.
Just drilling down for a minute on the bilateral opportunities we may have with the United States. To what extent has the election of a new administration in Washington made a difference in terms of this relationship? And what do you see as the prospects for the two countries working closely together to take a more North American approach toward how we deal with climate change?
Well, it's quite different. I would say that in some respects, it's perhaps almost too different in the sense of there's a universe that we were operating in before, and there's a universe we're operating in now. And it might be healthier for the world if those universes were a little bit more closely aligned. But I would tell you it's completely different from what we were experiencing under the previous administration. I mean, I was dealing with somebody who in that administration that really was not convinced of the reality of climate change. And now I'm dealing with folks who actually have enormous ambition to make progress and make progress very quickly. I mean, they have now committed in the United States to a net zero grid by 2035. Well, I mean, I will tell you that would be challenging for us, and we have an 85% clean grid as it is. They do not have anything remotely close to that. So they have boundless ambition, which is a good thing. I think that they still have a lot of work to do to define exactly how they're going to achieve, what they want to do in terms of ambition. But it is opening up all kinds of conversations for us. And certainly on the automotive side, that's really important given the integrated nature of our automotive sector, both light duty and heavy duty. On the methane side, I think it enables a better conversation and helps to address some of the concerns around competitiveness that some in the oil and gas space have had in the past. The discussion around electricity. I mean, if they're really going to green their grid very quickly, they're going to need new sources of non-emitting electricity, and that may open up some opportunities for Canada to actually wield clean electricity from Quebec or Manitoba or Newfoundland to the United States to help them with that and to gain economic advantage for us. So I am quite bullish on this, but and I will tell you, there's a lot of work going on. I mean, as you saw when the Prime Minister and President Biden met, one of the first things they did was kicked off a high-level ministerial on climate action with myself and John Kerry. We met the next day, and we've been actively meeting since that time. So I think there's a lot we can do, but I also think that not to be presumptuous, because the Americans are obviously a much bigger country than we are, but we've been working on this for 5 years now. I think there's some things that we can actually help them with.
There's speculation from time to time about green border taxes. And obviously there would be serious problems in North America if we took a different strategic approach on this from the United States. Are you satisfied that if either country moves ahead, it will be in tandem with the other?
Yeah, I am. And it's certainly something we have discussed a little bit, although I wouldn't say that it's a first order of business for the Americans or for us. But it is an active conversation. Certainly it's a very active conversation in Europe, where they are looking at that. A border carbon adjustment system. I just would say that, people talk about it a lot. There's certainly politicians in this country that talk about it as though somehow it was an easy thing to implement. It's not. And it's particularly not in the context of the United States, where they don't have an explicit price on pollution. And given the politics of the United States, that's a challenging issue from a legislative perspective. And so at least in the early term, they are probably going to advance climate action through massive investments and regulatory tools. And in that context, if you're going to have a border carbon adjustment system, which essentially says we're pricing carbon in this way, and therefore if country A it's trying to export in is not pricing it in the same way, you adjust in some way in terms of a tariff. If they don't have an explicit price in the United States, you've got to impute it. You've got to impute it for basically everything, right? You've got to calculate some kind of an effective way to actually impute the price on pollution. That's complicated. That's really complicated. And you would have to do effectively the same thing with people who are trying to export into your country that don't have an explicit price. So I would say it's an important conversation. I think over time, the world is probably going to move there. And I think it only works in North America if we do it together. But I wouldn't say that that's something that I foresee happening in the next, year or two.
Thank you. Let's turn to the issue of financing. One core aspect of innovation for Canada, especially for our resource sector, is the ability to draw in sustainable finance. Shifts in capital market in the form of TCFD, ESG frameworks are creating change, and the United Kingdom has signaled that the private finance agenda will be a top priority at COP26. Now, there are concerns that sustainable finance is increasingly being defined and advanced by countries that don't face the same challenges as resource-producing nations like Canada. What actions can the government and industry take to ensure that Canadian firms can access sustainable finance?
So, I think the first thing is something you referred to there, which is adopting disclosure, TCFD. That one of the, just from a starting position for most global financial firms that are looking to deploy capital, the first thing that they ask for and require is some level of disclosure with respect to climate issues and climate risk. So companies that aren't doing that are going to really struggle on a go-forward basis, I think, with respect to that, whether you make it mandatory or you don't. And I know the UK has said 2025, they're going to make it mandatory. Canada, that's a conversation that we obviously need to have with the provinces because the security regulations are not at the federal level. The second thing I would say is a plan to net zero. Companies need to have adopted a plan to net zero to describe how they're actually going to be working to reduce their exposure to emissions over time. I think that's increasingly going to be sort of table stakes in terms of accessing international capital. And then the third is to start to think about how we reimagine how our resource economy fits in the context of a low carbon world. And you know, certainly mining and minerals fits very much in the context of like, you need that in order to produce batteries and electric vehicles and all of these kinds of things. And so the discussion around supply chains and how mining fits into that. I think there's a similar conversation with respect to low carbon building products for the forestry sector, where, you know, in the long run, we're going to need to be actually thinking about how we build and construct different things in a manner that's actually consistent with a low carbon future. And I think there's a real opportunity there. I think that with respect to natural gas in particular, I think there's an interesting future in hydrogen. Which if you either capture and sequester the carbon or you drop it out in solid form, and there are people working on technologies to see how that might be done, all of a sudden you have a non-carbon source of energy that is a different pathway than electrification. And it's a pathway that actually could result in enormous exports of energy from Canada to other parts of the world. So I think we have to reimagine and we have to be able to articulate how the resource industries fit in the context of a low carbon future. I think they do, but we have to start to think and talk about it in that way.
Thank you. Let's turn for a moment to the circular economy. We hear a great deal of talk about it, and it's an area that your department is focused on through its efforts to reduce plastic waste and to develop more reusable products. But in many ways, public policy in Canada has yet to fully realize the circular economy opportunity, and we're behind many other countries. You know, from, for example, capturing waste heat, collecting critical minerals and mine tailings to innovative forestry products, there are many circular opportunities for the resource sector and businesses writ large. Is the government considering policies additional to those tabled on plastic waste to support innovation in circular economy-based business solutions?
Yeah, absolutely. And you are right. I mean, Canada is a little bit late to this party in terms of the circular economy. Europe's been talking about this for quite some time. We actually are hosting the World Circular Economy Forum in September of this coming year. Was supposed to be in Toronto, probably will end up being virtual. It's the first time it's ever been held in North America. It's typically been something that has been much more dominated by Europe. And it is in part to actually start to have these broader conversations around circular economy. We have started with plastics for a whole range of reasons, including that plastics increasingly are harmful in the environment. And I think there's a lot of trepidation about the long-term impacts of things like microplastics. But we do need to actually broaden that. We have started to do that with some things. So there is, you know, a commitment to develop a national strategy to encourage the remanufacturing of products. There is the Canadian Minerals and Metals Plan, which is looking at the issue of waste and turning it back into resources. There's a forest bioeconomy framework for Canada that NRCan is developing to think about how you use forestry residues and all kinds of things in the context of a bioeconomy. There's work on food waste that's going on in Agriculture Canada. But I do think we need to bring this more together, both to provide visibility, but also to actually engage better conversations. And there probably are other areas of the economy where we should be having similar conversations. So, you know, to be honest, we would welcome engagement from your organization and your members in as we move forward. And it certainly would invite you to participate in the World Circular Economy Forum when we have that in September.
Great, thank you. And we certainly would welcome that dialogue as well. Increasingly, we're hearing from our members about the importance of the circular economy and the opportunities that there are there for Canada and for Canadian business if we work again in a collaborative way in trying to achieve that. Can we turn back again to the government's commitment to achieve net zero by 2050? As you know, innovation and capital will be absolutely critical for Canada to meet this target. Now, are there things that public policy can do to draw capital to key sectors of Canada's economy Are there some policies that you believe to be important to support innovation within the business community? And how do you see the policies announced by the Healthy Environment and Healthy Economic Plan in driving these objectives?
So, I mean, I think, I guess a couple things. I would go back to, I think that a number of elements help to drive in the plan, help to drive this kind of innovation that we need to see, and the ability to actually attract international capital, which we are going to need. Certainly, the price is one of those, right? The price is really about driving innovation. It's, you know, businesses and individuals figuring out how they can actually make their day-to-day conduct more energy efficient, less greenhouse gas intensive, as a way to essentially reduce their exposure to a carbon price. That will drive innovation. And we certainly saw that here in British Columbia. I mean, British Columbia was the very first province in this country to implement a price on pollution under Gordon Campbell, the Premier Gordon Campbell, and it drove innovation. I worked in a biomass energy company. It actually drove innovation in terms of displacing natural gas with biomass heating, because of the fact that you actually had to price in the greenhouse gas emissions associated with gas. So that would be part of it. I think that providing long-term regulatory certainty is really important for global capital and for the attraction of capital, but it also drives innovation, like in the methane area, for example. And then, of course, you know, the supports for transition. I mean, we have to recognize that we are in some areas at an earlier stage, especially with respect to technology and technology deployment. And we have to recognize that, in my view, there is a role for government in helping to catalyze the development of industries. And so in the context, for example, of low carbon fuels, we put in place the Clean Fuel Standard, which will over time create opportunities for biofuels and hydrogen. But we actually want to ensure that people can comply, that there are low-cost compliance options for industry, such that we actually can, you know, create industry in a manner that actually is not going to be harmful for existing industry. And so the fund is really about catalyzing the domestic production of hydrogen and biofuels. And that will help oil and gas companies in terms of compliance, but it will also help us to start to grow an industry that can be a very big industry on a go-forward basis. So that was the whole structure of the plan, was to try to think about how this all fit together. And so there are carrots and there are sticks, and we try to match the carrots with the sticks.
Now, there's been a tremendous effort from Canada's business community to innovate and to make meaningful contributions to Canada's nationally determined contribution. In equal measure, the government has introduced an array of new regulations and policies to drive decarbonization and spur innovation. And one thing that's top of mind for the business community, particularly at the present time coming out of COVID, is how to balance new cumulative impacts posed to business from these regulations while pursuing capital-intensive clean technology projects to accelerate decarbonization. Are there some things the government is considering to help alleviate the costs from cumulative regulatory impacts? And I stress again that business is struggling at this point. The pandemic has hit it very badly. We're seeing the government, which had held back on a lot of regulatory initiatives during 2020, coming forward with a wide array of them now, which impose new costs on business. How can we reconcile this?
So I think, again, that's a good question. And I would say a couple things. I mean, the first is, if you read the climate plan that we have put into place, we actually don't lean nearly as heavily on regulation as you would have to if you didn't have a price on pollution. If you don't have that price, you've got to do it all through regulations, and the regulations would have to be quite draconian if you were going to get anywhere near to the targets that you would set. So we purposely have stayed away from using regulatory tools as the only driver of emissions reduction progress. But I would also say that we have recognized that there is a need to ensure that the regulations can work in a manner that they will be affordable and sustainable for business. So let me take, for example, the Clean Fuel Standard, which was the subject of a lot of conversation over the last number of years. Before we actually rolled out the new climate plan and concurrently put forward the Clean Fuel Standard to CG1 publication, we had an enormous amount of conversation with your organization and with other organizations, but certainly with the oil and gas sector, And I met with many of the CEOs in the oil and gas sector to really hear what their concerns were. And I don't think their concerns were that they didn't want to do anything, that they didn't recognize the importance of actually taking steps, but they wanted it done in a way that they felt like it could be managed. And at the end of the day, we made some changes near the end that I think made it more acceptable from the perspective of the oil and gas sector, including dropping the gaseous fuel part of the clean fuel standard. And concurrently, in the climate plan, we brought in the Clean Fuels Fund, which essentially is about helping them to comply. If you go back and you look at what came out from folks like Suncor and Cenovus and others in the aftermath of the climate plan, it wasn't negative. And in fact, it was quite positive with respect to how we had adjusted some of the issues in the Clean Fuel Standard. So we're trying to be responsive. It's not to say that there aren't going to be some regulations. There will have to be some regulation in order to actually meet the climate target and to drive the kind of change that we need to see. But we need to do it thoughtfully, and we need to engage with the business community to ensure that when we actually are moving forward, we're doing it in a way that's going to be workable.
Can we deal for a second with the impacts of the pandemic? If this conversation had been taking place a year ago and there had been no pandemic, how would the government's agenda on the environment be different from the way that it is now post-pandemic? Not post-pandemic, but as a result of the pandemic?
Well, it probably would be different in a couple of different ways. I mean, in the first instance, I think there were delays in all kinds of things across governments and in businesses over the course of the pandemic that we would have moved forward on a whole range of things that probably more rapidly had the pandemic not happened. We were supposed to have COP this year, right? I mean, it was supposed to be the year of global ambition. That didn't really happen because people just couldn't physically get together. But I would also say that on the environmental side, I think the pandemic has made Canadians more aware and sensitive to some of the challenges that exist on the horizon that are not going away. And the longer we pretend that they're not there, the more difficult the choices that we're going to have are. And certainly climate change is one of those. I would argue that the global loss in biodiversity is another one. And so I think people are increasingly sensitive to that, and therefore increasingly open to ambitious climate action that may or may not have happened in the absence of the pandemic. People look at these public opinion charts where it says, what's the number one issue, and it's all COVID, and then the environment has gone way down in the period of COVID, and that's true. And you'd be crazy not to think that on most people's minds, COVID is the number one issue. But if you actually probe people in terms of the issues that are really important to them and that they think need to be addressed, climate has actually gone up, not down during COVID, in terms of the depth of feeling that people have that it has to be addressed.
Minister, one final question for you. Obviously, when people think of your department these days, and particularly today with the Supreme Court decision, the issue of climate change is at the top of the list. But I think that it would be interesting to hear from you more broadly in terms of what your agenda is and what you hope to achieve during your time as minister. What are your highest priorities, and what do you see as being the transformative ways in which you can really make an impact? And how can business be helpful in that?
Well, thank you. That's a great question. I would say, first of all, I have to be honest that I got into politics largely because of the climate issue. So I would be lying if I didn't say that was probably the number one issue for me. I ran clean tech companies. I was very actively involved in the technology space, and I made the decision to enter politics because I worried a lot about the future my daughters will have in the absence of climate action. So but I also see the climate issue as not just an environmental issue, it's an economic issue. And we have to be thoughtful from an economic perspective about how we can gain advantage from the work that we can do to address climate. It's not being a rabid environmentalist and saying we don't care about the economic impacts is not going to be helpful for the country in the long run. We have to think about both. And so finding ways to partner economic development with environmental sustainability and climate action in particular is probably my number one issue. I would say the number two issue is we have to think about sustainability more generally. And this is an issue that absolutely involves the business community. We cannot continue to see the kind of decline in biodiversity that we see in this country. We now have almost 700 species in this country that are listed as species at risk. That just can't continue. And so we all have to be thinking about different models of economic exploitation of resources and those kinds of things that are done in a manner that can be consistent with the continued health of our natural environment. And I think that's a conversation that business must engage. I know some have, but they must engage because it's a conversation that, again, is one about finding pathways that will enable continued economic prosperity, but in the context of a more sustainable world. And then the final one is the one that you actually talked about earlier, which is I do think that from a mental perspective, we have to start to think around circularity, that we start to get rid of the idea of waste and we actually think about everything as a resource. And each of these three things are longer term issues, but I would hope to be able to, by the time that I am done and I go back to the private sector, that we've been able to advance those conversations in a meaningful way.
Minister, thank you. It has been a fascinating conversation. It's one that will continue over the course of the next few years. And I hope that you'll look to the business community as a partner in terms of trying to ensure that we have a healthy environment and good conditions in which all of us can live. We are part of the community. We're committed to ensuring a high quality of life and a clean environment as well. And we're most grateful to you for being with us, particularly today on such a busy day. Let me, in thanking you, turn things over to Sarah Fedorchuk, who's the Vice President of Public and Government Affairs with the Mosaic Company, to say a few words to close out the session. Sarah, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Perrin, and thank you, Minister Wilkinson and Mario, for arranging this session today on a very timely and important topic. As we work to improve environmental performance and manage the effects of climate change as a country, ongoing conversations like this between business and government is so important. Together, we help define a common understanding of the opportunities and challenges for Canadian businesses, and we're creating goals that we can all work towards successfully. And as a nation that relies heavily on trade and export, and a company that relies heavily on export, it is encouraging to hear the ideas that came forward today and how we can work to advance our common interests. And Canada is already setting the bar in so many areas when it comes to environmental stewardship and performance. And I know in my own experience with colleagues from the United States, South America, and Asia, that Canada is really viewed as a leader and quite often serves as an example of best practices in various areas. And then of equal importance is maintaining a competitive business climate for Canadians so that our large number of key export commodities, which are found in other parts of the world, can also continue to be exported to areas where maybe environmental concerns aren't top of mind. I know that those of us in the mining and natural resources sector are encouraged by the work that Natural Resources Canada has been doing on the Canadian Minerals and Mining Plan, and also the Canadian list of critical minerals, and we look forward to the continued discussion. So thank you very much, Minister, for your time today and everyone's involvement in today's session.
So thank you, Sarah, for the kind words. Thank you, Perrin, for hosting a great chat. Et merci, Monsieur le Ministre. Je pense qu'on pourrait dire aussi que pendant la pandémie, une chose qui est devenue de plus en plus apparente pour les Canadiens, c'est la place de l'entreprise dans les communautés. Ouais. Il y a plus de divergence entre le gouvernement et business et tout ça. On est tous dans le même bateau à essayer de trouver des solutions. Donc, we're really looking forward to crystallize these potential synergies and pursue common destinations. So thanks a lot for your insights. Thanks for your time. And now we'll go to break. So we'll take a few minutes. We're back, I think, in 4 minutes to the next session of our executive summit. Donc, merci à tout le monde.
Thank you.